Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another Q&A video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and we have 4 pages of questions today to go through, all sent in by the awesome folks who support Forgotten Weapons on Patreon and make this channel possible. So, let's get right into it. First question is from Leslie, who says, now that the FAMAS is being superseded in French service by the HK 416, do you think we will start to see FAMAS parts kits in the USA? Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure the answer is no. The French have not, they've gotten out of the habit of surplusing firearms. Instead, they either destroy them or they give them as military aid to other countries, mostly French countries that they have an ex-colonial sort of affiliation with. So maybe there's a tiny possibility that someone will manage to get some demilitarized, chopped up parts into the US. I'm not sure what the best case scenario we could really hope for there is. But if I were you, I would not get my hopes up for any FAMAS parts kits. They're certainly not going to come into the country in bulk. Next question is from Mike. Says, is there any reason for heel release magazines continuing on well into the 19th century, particularly in European handguns? I would expect the thumb release to make them obsolete. Is there some advantage I'm not aware of? Well, I think the main reason that the heel release was used is because it was almost impossible to accidentally activate, and it really encouraged magazine retention. So here in the US, especially today, we're used to competitive shooting where a fast reload is absolutely the goal, and maintaining control of your expended magazines isn't that big of a deal. Well, in most military services, you're only issued 1 or 2 magazines with a sidearm, and it's important to keep them. If for no other reason than bureaucratically you're responsible for them, and if you lose the magazines, then you have to fill out a whole pile of paperwork to deal with getting them replaced. That heel release encourages you to, or forces you, to grab the magazine and pull it out of the gun, and then it's stuck in your hand, and you can then choose exactly what you want to do with it. Stick it in a pocket, pouch, in your tunic, whatever. The magazine release buttons tend to allow you to drop the mag with one hand. Pop like that, or rather with your thumb if you're right-handed. Magazine drops out and you can get a nice fast reload. But that nice fast reload isn't really what the military is focused on. So I know there are a couple examples like the Russians. The Tokarev had a thumb release button, and the Russian military decided that that was causing too many accidental magazine releases. Which is definitely a problem. If you're holstering the gun and the mag falls out and you don't notice it until you go to draw the gun to use it, that's a major problem. And that's why the Russians went from the thumb, the mag release button on the Tokarev to the heel release on the Makarov. Next question is from Matt. Matt says, I frequently see Berthiers manufactured by Continsouza for sale on various auction sites, but they seem to be valued lower than ones from MAS and MAC. Any insight into these similar firearms not being manufactured by the big two? Are they considered of lesser quality? So there are a couple things to address here. First off, Continsouza didn't actually make guns. Continsouza manufactured receivers, which were then shipped to other arsenals to be assembled into completed guns. So when you're talking about relative quality, when it comes to the actual firearm, there are no Continsouza guns. Now, because the receiver happens to be marked with its manufacturer's name, you will end up with guns where the primary marking is Continsouza, Establishment Continsouza, but they didn't actually make the guns. Now, I suspect the reason that you're seeing them priced lower is Continsouza started a little bit late in the game, and most of the Continsouza Berthiers you find have been refurbished by the French and rebuilt in the 1920s and 30s, and so they're mostly in the post-war configuration. The clearing rods have been removed. All of the upgrades have been made. They've got handguards. They've usually got the 5-round magazines. They've got the improved sights from the 1920s. They're N-marked from the 1930s, reamed for ball N. And those guns are a lot more, those are by far the most common Berthiers to find. And so they are less valuable than pre-war configuration guns that, say, are still in a 3-round configuration. They don't have handguards. They're in the original chambering, they haven't been reamed out for ball N. They still have their clearing rods, that sort of thing. And so you will not find any pre-war guns marked Continsouza because Continsouza didn't start making receivers until during World War I. So it's not so much that a Continsouza made gun is less valuable. It's that they happen to be of the less valuable type. Next up is from Nemo, who says, you've mentioned one drawback to your FAMAS was the weak magazines. Have you looked into having a smith or craftsman make you more durable ones out of steel or thicker aluminum? No, I have not. The cost of manufacturing like 10 new magazines is going to be astronomical, far more than the cost of just getting some additional spare FAMAS magazines, standard ones, and being careful with them. So they are out there and available. They're expensive, but they are available. So my plan is just to have more than I need and be careful with them, and they should last me as long as I need them to. Matt says, I've got a good one for you. I am aware of the US military naming scheme for submachine guns, carbines, and rifles. M1 subgun, M3 subgun, there was also an M2. M1 carbine, M2 carbine, M1 rifle, etc., etc., etc. My question is, why were the M2 and M3 carbines named M2 and M3 when they are clearly modifications of the M1 carbine? Why not M1A or M1B? That is a very good question. And I believe, having not actually looked up the official US government documentation on it, I expect that the rationale is because they continue to issue M1 carbines in addition to M2s and M3s. I think the change in designation comes when a new pattern is superseding the existing pattern. So, for example, once they had the M3A1 grease gun, they stopped manufacturing M3s. And in theory, it was going to be replaced by the M3A1. Whether it actually was entirely or not is a different issue, but they stopped issuing M3s once they were issuing M3A1s. With the M1 carbines, the M2 carbine was a full auto variant, and it was not necessarily issued to everybody. That's even more the case with the M3, which was the version with the infrared night sight on it. That was not intended to replace every M1 carbine in service. And they would continue issuing M1 carbines even when they had 2s and 3s. And so that's the reason that they maintained the separate designations. Next from Matt, but a different Matt, says, what was your first parts kit build? Or if you haven't built one, what would you build? No AR-15s. They don't count. That's playing with Legos. I agree. Building an AR-15 is an assembly project. Before that was super common, there were people out there building other firearms in a process that took a lot more actual manufacturing sort of, well, maybe not manufacturing, but mechanical expertise or practice or skills. The first ones I ever did were AKs. In fact, that's the vast majority of the guns I've ever built. Back when AK parts kits were super cheap, when you could get a great parts kit with the original barrel and all matching and everything unissued basically for under $100, and you could then get all of the parts required to assemble it into a legal firearm, all the semi-auto parts, all the American-made parts. You could get all that plus a receiver or receiver flat for $50 to $150. You were looking at a total cost of maybe $200 to $250 in each gun. That was really great economically, and I didn't have a lot of money to throw around, and I did a bunch of that, and it was a lot of fun. It was really cool. I built some from flats where I actually bent the flats, did the heat treating, riveted in, riveted in the trunnions, spot welded in the guide rails, the ejector thing. I did a bunch of those, and it was a lot of fun. I also did some built from pre-made receivers, mostly Nodak Spud receivers. They were the best option out there, and I'm pretty sure they still are. I have long since stopped doing that because you can basically buy a complete gun now for the cost of a good parts kit. It's still a fun project mechanically, and it's a fun experience to have and a good learning process, but it's not the economic. There isn't the economic rationale that there was 10 years ago. I've built some other stuff as well, but yeah, the first and the most were AKs. All 7.62x39 ones, by the way. Next up is from Jonathan, who says, do you think the Pedersen device would have been the windfall the U.S. thought it would have been had the war continued into 1919? No. In fact, I think that the best answer to that question is for you to go and watch the extended video on the Pedersen device that was done by C&Rsenal. Othais and May did a great video on the Pedersen device, really getting into its history and development, and they had their hands on one that they were able to get working and do a bunch of shooting with. And their commentary on the complete impracticality of that That weapon is excellent, and it would have been, unless it went through a lot more development before it got to the front lines, it would have been a real disaster, I think, for anyone in the US military who was issued one in World War I in 1919. So I'll have a link to their video on the Pedersen Device in the description below. Definitely check that out if you're interested in it. Next up, we have a question from Michael. It says, when it comes to auto-loading semi-auto systems, which has the longest dwell time? And wouldn't this make for the best system for being suppressed, since the pop at the ejection port would be minimized? Or is the difference too small to be worth it? Love the videos and the amazing information. Thanks. Well, thank you. The one with the longest dwell time is going to be the long recoil system, as most commonly used on the Browning Auto 5 and the Remington 11, which is a copy of the Browning Auto 5, also on the Shosha and the Remington Model 8 rifles, and not a whole lot else. However, and yes, I think that would probably be the best system for suppressing, because with long recoil leaves the bolt fully locked with the cartridge case and maintaining a gas seal for, without any doubt, the longest time period of any firearm action. The problem is long recoil is not really all that practical for hanging a suppressor on the end of. Doing that, you're going to add a substantial amount to the moving weight of the parts, and I think you're going to have a substantial potential for unreliability, because you're trying to, long recoil is based on, you know, the mass and the velocity of parts moving that are carefully calculated. When you hang a relatively heavy suppressor on the end of the barrel, you're disrupting all of that, all those mechanics. And on top of that, there aren't very many guns out there that are long recoil. So are you really super concerned about suppressing a Remington Model 8? Probably not. Most of the stuff out there is gas operated, because it has a fixed barrel, and it's just a lot more practical to make a self-loading rifle with a fixed barrel. So yeah, it probably, in academic terms, it would be the best system for suppressing, but there are a bunch of other factors out there that make it less desirable to do so. Next question is from Anders, who says, I know from your in-range videos you take safety very seriously. I do. So I've always wondered why you're not including clearing the weapon at the beginning of Forgotten Weapons videos. Even if you know the weapon is clear, wouldn't it be good to show that habit to the viewers? To be honest, I trust that you guys are mature enough to know that guns should be cleared before you start messing around with them without me having to show you on every single video. So I do that occasionally when it's appropriate, when it's convenient, when it just sort of happens on camera anyway, we'll include it. But to me, I find it a little bit almost demeaning to the audience to go out of my way to show that on every single gun in every single video. I do take it seriously, and I always check these things before I'm filming them. In fact, in most cases, especially if I'm doing disassembly on a gun, I will have taken it apart and reassembled it before I even start filming, to make sure that I've got the whole process understood properly and in my head, and that makes it go more smoothly on camera. And so I will have checked these things a whole bunch of times and completely torn them down usually before filming starts. And I don't honestly think it's necessary for me to show you guys every time. You know how to be safe with guns. Next up is Gary. It says, if someone is starting to collect historical firearms, are there one or two things they should never do? I would say my first recommendation would be, if you don't know what it is, don't buy it. I've gotten a lot of feedback from people who send me pictures of something, and they think they bought something really cool, and they're like, I think this is something really cool, check out these pictures. And it turns out, usually, it's a sporterized version of something that's standard. So my admonition would be, especially if this isn't a recreational thing, or if you're not buying the gun specifically to shoot it, if you're buying it because it's a historical piece for a collection, know what it is before you pay for it. And often that would probably require having some reference data before you start buying guns. I think spending $100 on some books before you spend $1,000 on some guns is an excellent investment, and it may not turn out to be necessary the first time you buy a gun or the second, but sooner or later, I can absolutely guarantee that the money spent on books will be worth it, saving you money on guns that you would have bought or would have overpaid for had you not had the reference books and the knowledge to know exactly what you were getting. The other thing I would say is be extremely careful with the idea of buying a sporterized gun with the intention of rebuilding it, because most of the time you're not the first person to come up with that idea. You're about the 1,000th person to do so, and they're usually there's not usually a large supply of the parts that you will need to rebuild a sporterized gun. Ross 1910s, for example, a whole mess of those things have been sporterized, cut down for use as hunting rifles. And when that's done, the stock's cut down and the nose cap is boop, thrown away. And sometimes the barrel band is also thrown away, depending on how severe the sporterization is. So you can get a sporterized Ross for like half or a third the cost of an intact military pattern one. And that can initially look like a really good opportunity to get the sporterized gun. And then all you have to do is get a stock and that nose cap, and presto, you've saved yourself $500. Well, the problem is it's extremely difficult to find stocks, and even more difficult to find the barrel hardware, because the people who sporterize these things aren't keeping track of those parts. They're boop, throwing them away, gone. So you will generally, as a general rule, you will pay more to buy a sporterized gun and get the requisite parts to rebuild it into its military configuration than you would to wait, spend more money, and get a gun that's still intact as it came out of the factory. In addition to that, once you start collecting more seriously, you'll realize that there are a lot of variations in things like stocks and barrel hardware. And Arasakas are a good example here. The stocks actually have proof marks on them, or acceptance marks from the specific arsenals where they were made and accepted. And so if you buy a sporterized Arasaka from one arsenal, now if you want it to really be correct, you need to get not just an intact stock, you need to get an intact stock from the correct arsenal to put on that rifle. So usually that's a losing game. Next page. William says, hi Ian, I've got a weird one for you. Got a great one and a weird one. There are examples on the internet, most of them fake, of items that are haunted or possessed. Books, dolls, pictures, etc. In your career as a researcher, have you ever encountered anything like that, be it firearms related or perhaps locations you have visited? I can pretty conclusively say, no, I have not. I'm extremely skeptical when it comes to that sort of paranormal thing. I do not believe that there is such a thing as haunted or possessed items, locations, or otherworldly stuff. So, nope. I have some things, like I have an Arasaka that's pretty well covered in flamethrower damage and was picked up from a guy who was holding it when it got hit by a flamethrower, and I have never gotten the slightest hint of any sort of paranormal activity surrounding that rifle. And I think if there would be such a thing, that might be the place where you'd see it. So, definite no answer for that question. Next one is from Sean. Why did most of the major powers during the mid-1800s choose to waste a great deal of money, time, and effort with single-shot bolt action and then tube-fed bolt actions, only to replace them just a few years later with box magazine rifles without really waiting to see if this new system would work? Love the channel. Keep up the good work here and on InRange. Thank you. I think because half of the purpose of a military force is deterrence. And you lose a lot of deterrent value if your potential adversaries think that you have substandard equipment and that your military would actually be fairly easy to defeat. So for a lot of these countries, having an up-to-date modern military rifle wasn't just about how it actually performed in the field. It was about the impression or the image that it gave other people of your military prowess. So on top of that, there was also, it's not just the change from single shot to repeating to box magazine, like like Mausers. I presume you're talking about fixed internal double stacked box magazines. There is also the issue of smokeless powder coming up in the middle there. Generally, all of the tube magazine guns, with the exception of the Lebel, were designed and manufactured during the black powder period, and the change from black powder to smokeless was far more significant than the change from a tube magazine to a box magazine. And I think that is, you can see the difference from a single shot rifle to a repeating rifle. That's pretty substantial in terms of combat effectiveness. And then the change from black powder to smokeless powder was just as significant, if not more so. And that's what countries were upgrading. I think a lot of countries were in this position of looking at it and going, you know, if I'm still sitting here in 1895, 1898, 1900 with a black powder rifle, we're behind the curve. We'll be easy to defeat militarily. And if we don't want to get into a war, we need to look like we're stronger, or literally be stronger, and thus we need to have a more modern rifle. This was a major period in arms technology development, and you wouldn't see that happen again until self-loading rifles came around about between 40 and 50 years later. So you'll see the same sort of period of development or upgrades going on basically during and just after World War II. Next question is from Roy. What stalled blowback open bolt SMGs from development before World War I? It seems that there was smokeless powder. A simple SMG would have been obvious, but it seems that they kept working with complex designs until the Sten. It's not really that they were making complex designs. The mechanical operating of the Sten is basically identical to the operating system of the very first submachine guns, like the MP-18. What changed around World War II was the fabrication techniques and the cost of the guns. So before World War II, people were manufacturing submachine guns to the same sort of quality standards that they were making rifles. You had pretty complex milled receivers. In particular, look at a gun like the MP-38. That thing could be made with a really simple tubular receiver, but instead, at the beginning, as the MP-38, it was actually a machined from a piece of bar stock tube. It took a lot of man hours and a lot of expense to do that. I think the rationale there was the numbers required were relatively low, especially with submachine guns. This was before anyone really thought it would be a good idea to equip entire armies with submachine guns. That started with the Soviets during World War II. So they weren't making a whole lot of the guns. They had their manufacturing standards that were not, that had been well established and weren't unusual. And at this point, we also are still in this period of time where workmanship is less expensive than materials. So today, workmanship, man hours are the cheap part of manufacturing something, especially with all the automation we have. The expensive part, or the more expensive part, is the material cost going into the item. Well, 100 years ago, the opposite was true. And that's why you see a lot of these conversions of existing guns to new types. A lot of conversions of single-shot rifles into repeating rifles, conversions of muzzle loaders into breech loaders, because even if you had to replace half the parts in the gun, being able to keep, for example, the barrel saved you a lot of material cost, and that was worth it, even given the workmanship that was required. Paying some guys, some artisans, some fabricators, some machinists to do the conversion or make the new parts. So submachine guns prior to World War II fall into that category, and it was only during World War II that people started trying to crank out large numbers of submachine guns very quickly, and then people realized, all right, our manufacturing techniques have to change here because we can't keep doing this really high quality stuff anymore. And that's when you start getting stamped sheet metal guns. And then, of course, people discover that those work just as well as the really fancy, expensive old stuff. And so you stick with sheet metal until we end up with, later on, polymer submachine guns, and that's what we still have today. Jason says, Ian, was the MAB-15 ever an official French military service weapon? I can't find a definitive answer. No, MAB-15 was never formally adopted by the French military. It may have been used in some small numbers by someone like the Foreign Legion, some of the sort of ancillary units, not the standard metropolitan army. And it was definitely used by some gendarmerie or other government security service organizations, but not the actual official French army. Seth says, how often do you travel? Does it complicate keeping up with friends, family, significant others? I spend about 40 to 50% of my time traveling these days. It's really quite a lot. In fact, it's gotten to the point where I travel as much as I feasibly can. So I have a lot of people who have offered, hey, you should come visit this collection or this museum. And it's like, I'd love to. Really, legitimately, I would like to. It looks like a great opportunity. But let me pencil you in on the schedule when I'm next available in 2023, that kind of thing. So right now, I have 7 auction trips per year that I do, so every other month I've got one of those, and I'm typically doing 2 international trips each year, and then there are usually a smattering of other trips within the US as well. Does it complicate keeping up with friends, family, etc.? A little bit, not a whole lot. It certainly it gives some time pressure for filming in-range material. We have to plan out carefully when we're going to be able to do that when Carl and I are both around. It makes getting to matches often a little difficult, making sure that I'm in town for the specific weekends when matches are going on. And significant other, no, if I stick around too long, my wife kind of starts looking at me going like, when are you leaving again? Don't you have to be somewhere? So no, fortunately, I enjoy traveling, and it works out. I can't really do any more of it than I am right now, but it works. All right, our next question here is from Dina. It says, Ian, have you ever been to the World War I Museum in Kansas City? If so, did you enjoy it? If not, do you plan to? I have never been there. However, I have actually had quite a lot of people recommend the place to me. So one of these days I will have to stop in and see what all the commotion is about. That's all I can say. I don't really know anything more about it than that, except I've had a lot of people recommend it. All right, next up is from Spencer. It says, best Milsurp bolt gun for lefties, or best setup Milsurp for lefties in general. Well, I would say in general, it would be a pretty easy shot for the M1 Garand, because the bolt handle's on the proper side. It's easy to reload. By the way, the proper reloading technique for an M1 is to hold on to the gun with your left hand, and then you take your right hand with the clip, put the clip in the gun, and then you actually use the heel of your right hand to hold the bolt handle back. Use your thumb to push the clip into the gun, and then when you release your hand, either the bolt will go forward and chamber around, or you'll need to then tap it with the heel of your hand. But either way, that prevents you from getting flies in your face and M1 thumb. So now as for bolt actions, honestly, for me, anything that is cock on closing works pretty much the same. The Lee Enfield works pretty well. The 1917 Enfield works well. There are cock on close Mausers, early pattern Mausers that are good. Beyond that, I don't see a whole lot of variation between the different designs as far as left-hand utility goes. I've had a lot of people recommend a K31 with a left-hand adapter for the bolt handle. And I've seen those, I'm familiar with them. I've never really been all that interested in getting one because to me, my interest in the K31 is as a collectible, as a military firearm. And putting on, geez, this guy's really persistent. Putting on a left-hand bolt adapter to me kind of defeats the point. I'm not trying to have a K31 that I can shoot as quickly as possible. That's just not my goal. So I'm not really looking to buy some accessories to further that particular goal. Next question is from Commander31. It says, what other self-loading pistol design could have become as prominent as the Browning system currently is if history had gone differently? I think the most likely candidate there is a rotating barrel system. It works pretty darn well. There's not a whole lot of difference pro and con wise between it and the tilting barrel system. I think the tilting barrel system is a little bit more economical to manufacture, and that's why it has really taken over as the predominant system. But the rotating barrel's a very close follow-up, as you can see from the fact that they're still making rotating barrel pistols today. Beretta has one. The PX4 is a Beretta Cougar, and PX4 are rotating barrel guns. They kind of always, they periodically show up in history, and they never quite they never come close to replacing the tilting barrel, but they're never bad guns. They're just, they don't offer a whole lot of particular advantage over the tilting barrel, and vice versa in an alternate history scenario. Next one is from Sean. What is the rationale behind some countries' bans on owning firearms in military chamberings? Well, the one in particular that I am aware of is Italy, which prohibits civilian possession of 9x19 in particular. I think other military cartridges as well. And I believe the origin of that was actually from organized crime buying firearms or stealing firearms and ammunition from the military. Corrupt military service members selling their ammunition to organized crime. And apparently the solution wasn't, put the guys in jail or stop them from doing it. The solution was, let's just make it illegal for anyone outside the military to own 9x19, and then step 3, profit, I guess. That's typically been the solution, trying to prevent civilian usage of military arms. So I don't think it's ever worked all that well. France has dropped most of their regulations on that matter. There have never been a lot of countries that do that. I know Italy is one of the other big ones. I think that's about it. I probably shouldn't even say that without actually checking first, but someone will definitely tell me in the comments if there are some other major countries that prohibit specifically military calibers. Let's see. Next up we have Christopher. Hi Ian, what firearm, either singly or as a group of firearms that faded into obscurity, were a tweak away from greatness? Well, honestly, the AR-10 was a pretty darn good gun that fell victim to a lot of kind of coincidental problems. Now, it did make a comeback in 5.56 as the AR-15, so maybe you could call that the tweak. But had there been a manufacturer who was able to more quickly and more easily produce 308 caliber, 7.62 caliber AR-10s, I think there's a very real possibility that you would have seen a large portion of NATO adopt that rifle. We'll get into that as its own separate video, like what actually happened to the AR-10. Why is it seemingly such a great gun that got adopted by Portugal, Sudan, Guatemala, and basically nobody else? Next one is from Ian, who says, was the Lebel the single, this isn't actually me, this is a different Ian, was the Lebel the single largest leap forward in small arms technology in history? If not, what else? I would say no. The jump from black powder to smokeless powder is very significant, but I think the jump from muzzle loading to self-contained cartridges was more significant. I think that gives you a greater increase in firepower and firearm effectiveness. The ability to have, you really went from a rate of fire of something like 2 or 3 per minute to a rate of fire that could reach 30 or 40 per minute, and that's really significant. So there were a lot of early iterative steps towards the true modern, as we know it today, self-loading cartridge. If I had to pick one particular firearm to exemplify that, I would be tempted to say the 1860 Henry. It was certainly not the first cartridge firing firearm, but it was one of the first that was both very reliable and really really exemplified the increase in rate of fire and firepower made possible by the self-contained cartridge. You could lay down a tremendous barrage of firepower from an 1860 Henry relative to everything else that was around in its day. Craig says, what was the coolest pawn shop or small gun shop find you ever had? There are 2 of them. One of them was my Pedersen Berthiers carbine, which was not actually found by me. It was found by a viewer who sent me a Facebook message actually and said, hey, I think there's a Pedersen Berthiers in my local gun shop. And I thought to myself, well, I doubt it. It's probably something else. It's probably a standard rifle. And asked for pictures, and he sent them to me, and I'm like, well, hot dang, that really is. And so he ended up buying it. I bought it from him. By the way, no straw purchase issues there because it is legally an antique pre-1898. The other one, the one that I found myself, was actually a Scody Model X. The Scody X that you've seen on video on the channel a couple of years ago. I found that at a little gun shop in Tombstone, Arizona, of all places. Like, how on earth that rifle ended up in that shop? Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. I know how it did. It was brought back by a vet who ended up living out in southeastern Arizona, and when he died, his widow brought it into the shop, where I found a freaking Scody Model X in a little out-of-the-way touristy gun shop, and bought it. Next page. Sleep says, recoil is highly variable by firearm, even within the same cartridge. Yes, it is. As I understand it, muzzle energy is kinetic, recoil is momentum transfer, aka impulse. Is there a standard formula where you can plug in projectile mass, energy, muzzle energy, and mass of the firearm and get the felt recoil impulse? Did people ever try to calculate this historically, or in the days of bolt actions and full power cartridges, did weapons developers just say, well, Private Bloggins is looking a bit kicked, better make the stock heavier? All right, so a couple things to address there. First off, yes, there is absolutely a fairly simple formula that you can plug in all of those numbers and get an answer. However, that formula is only valid for a single shot firearm or a non-semi-auto firearm. That formula does not take into account any sort of energy absorption, any amount of that recoil energy used by the firearm to cycle, which is one of the more important parts, especially for modern firearms. So you can tell, I mean, the formula is pretty simple. It's how much mass and velocity going forward do you have, and how much weight in the gun, and that gives you an answer in foot-pounds of how much recoil energy you have. However, when you get to like what makes a gun kick more than another gun in the same cartridge, what you've got there with a self-loading firearm can be much more significant than just the weight of the gun. There are a lot of other factors. For example, you can see a gun like the Shosha. In fact, we have some high-speed video I've taken of Shosha's firing, and you can see when the bolt assembly, barrel and bolt assembly, actually reaches the end of transfer, the end of its travel, it then imparts all of its energy into the receiver. It basically hits the receiver and stops, and then the receiver starts moving, and that is actually what gives you the felt recoil from the firearm. On the other end, it's really significant on the Shosha. On the other end of the spectrum, you have guns like the Ultimax with its what's called a constant recoil system, where the gun is designed so that the bolt assembly never actually contacts the end of the receiver. The spring rates are set such that the bolt decelerates to a complete stop without actually hitting the back of the gun. And that produces a lot less energy transfer to the shooter. In addition, we also have to think about the energy over unit of time. So something like the Shosha, you're getting a certain amount of recoil energy, but it's all being transmitted in one short time period as the gun gets kicked back into you. With constant recoil, you've got a certain amount of recoil energy, but because it's being spread out over a much longer period of time as the bolt decelerates, that feels like a lot less recoil to the shooter. So there are a lot of factors going on once you get beyond basically the bolt action rifle side of this calculation. As for militaries experimenting with it, I'm not aware of much. The one example I am aware of is actually when the French were developing, I believe, the FRF1. They actually had a system at Saint-Étienne where they had a hanging pendulum, or a hanging shooting bench, basically, that they had a guy firing in, and they could watch how much the whole assembly moved backwards like a pendulum and calculate very easily the amount of recoil energy that was being generated. Exactly what they used that for, I'm not entirely sure at this point, but it's an interesting anecdote. Grant says, hi Ian, why don't we see more straight pull bolt action rifles in military service? Also, why don't we see more bolt action to semi-auto conversions on the civilian market, i.e. converting old Lee Enfields to semi-auto? Well, the first part of the question is because straight pull military bolt action rifles don't really give you much advantage. They're not really any faster than traditional turn bolts. You can actually see this a bit. Bloke on the Range did a series of Mad Minute videos that include a Swiss K31 as well as a Wasp, as well as Mausers, Enfields, and others, and found a negligible difference in actual speed of shooting. The reason is that straight pull has to have a camming mechanism to rotate the bolt head at the beginning of its travel. That is generally a fairly stiff part of the action, and it takes you, as a practical matter, just as long to do that as it would to lift the bolt up, which is generally a bit easier of an exercise. So even on top of that, that kind of minute difference in shot-to-shot speed isn't really something that militaries are often concerned with. It's something I'm sure they pay attention to, but it's not the top thing on their list of priorities. Things like durability, cost, economy, reliability are all factors that are much more important to a military force than, how fast can you get your split times down. So as for the second part of your question, why don't we see more bolt to semi-auto conversions? The answer is because They're almost without exception horrible and unreliable and prone to breakage. They're extremely cool and extremely unpractical. I have not yet seen one that looked like a particularly practical firearm. So there's that. Derek says, what are your thoughts on the use of the Benelli shotgun style inertial system as an alternative to roller delayed blowback or gas delayed blowback in semi-automatic rifles? Seems like it would be a light, easy to use system that would tolerate fouling. Has anyone tried to make such a rifle? Well, as I am filming this, I have actually just recently posted a video on the Nkunzi PAW, that 20mm shoulder-fired grenade launcher from South Africa, which is also inertially operated, or inertially locked. I think that system does actually have a remarkable amount of potential to it. It is a system that is less prone to easy understanding, and that may be why it's not used as much. I would be very interested in delving more into that system and what are its pros and cons. And that's an area that I don't know enough about to make any comment beyond that right now. I think it is definitely worthy of some look. Maybe there are some downsides to it that I'm not aware of yet, or maybe it's just such an unusual and unorthodox system that there aren't a lot of designers who are paying attention to it. Next up is Jeffrey. Says, why did the Type 14 Nambu obtain such a poor reputation as a service pistol? Granted, the 8mm Nambu round is anemic compared to 45 ACP, but that can't be the only reason it was given a poor reputation. No, I don't think it was. I think the two reasons that the Type 14, well, okay, 3 reasons. The Type 14 has a bad reputation. No, 4. All right, 4 reasons. Number 1 is that stupid design feature that allows you to push the sear from the side. That right there is enough for virtually everybody to look at it and go, it must be the worst gun ever. What a stupid system. When in reality, as a practical matter, it's not nearly the issue that people make it out to be. So that's number 1. Number 2 is it was Japanese. This was a very foreign culture to the US in World War II. All of their firearms were domestically designed, or almost all of them. The Nambu doesn't really have any relationship to any Western designs that people would have been used to or recognize. We had a pretty substantial propaganda effort during World War II to make the Japanese out to be incompetent and militarily inferior, and a lot of that stuck with their firearms. Helped by number 3, which is 8mm Nambu ammunition was completely unobtainable in the United States. It was never made in the US. Anyone who brought back a Nambu as a souvenir had basically their only opportunity to shoot it would have been any ammunition they happened to bring back with it from the Pacific Theater. And most people did not bring back ammunition. Most people brought back a pistol as a war trophy. So when you get a gun that looks weird, number 4 here, by the way, is that it looks awkward and ungainly. So you have a gun that looks ungainly. Everyone has been telling you that the Japanese guns are crap. You don't have any opportunity to actually shoot it yourself to find out. Most people are just going to take what they're being told at face value and assume that naturally it must be a completely lousy pistol. In reality, yeah, it's underpowered. Yes, it only has a 6-round magazine. Yes, it has this stupid design feature that allows you to drop the sear by pushing on the side. All of that being said, it's still not the worst pistol out there. So, on the opposite end of the spectrum, Billy asks, what makes the Colt Python and Anaconda so special? I would say kind of the exact opposite features. The Python in particular was extremely well made. It was one of the last guns that Colt made that was really done with an extremely high level of individual craftsmanship. They're gorgeous guns. They shoot great. They feel great in the hand. They're mechanically magnificent. And then on top of that, there's a lot of mythos built up around the Colt Python because everyone says all of those things about it. So today, if you ask someone, what's a really good revolver? They're not going to say a Mandarin MR73. They're going to say a Colt Python because that's the one that they've all heard about. And it doesn't hurt that if you actually get your hands on one and shoot it, they are in fact legitimately excellent guns. And Colt's quality did definitely go down afterwards. So a lot of people think Colt could resurrect itself today by bringing back the Python. The fact of the matter is, I don't think Colt today could afford to make the Python to the level of quality that people would expect, to the level of quality that they did when they were originally making it. So the Python has kind of become an investment tool for a lot of gun people. Prices on Pythons have gone really just crazily high, in my opinion, because people are buying them as this single iconic example of fantastic American firearms production. I guess the short version of this is the Colt Python is extremely well made. It's a great gun. And on top of that, it has gotten all of the press as being an extremely great gun that magnifies its actual quality in its reputation. So it has a reputation probably even greater than its actual quality. John W. says, aside from the Russian VSS, what are some other rifles produced with the specific goal of being as quiet as possible? Can you comment on the general absence of suppressors in general military use? There generally aren't. The only guns that have been militarily developed to be quiet are guns specifically designed for special forces and shooting sentries, basically. You do have some things like the Welrod pistol, the Delisle carbine. OSS didn't ever really produce a specifically silenced firearm, but they did use a bunch of silencers on 22 caliber rifles, as well as high standard pistols or Colt Woodsman pistols. I think mostly high standards. I think the biggest reason that the general military forces don't use suppressed firearms or suppressors is that a significant amount of the utility of a military firearm is the noise it makes. Consider how much of the effect of firearms in the modern military sense is suppression. The whole way that the U.S. military has operated since World War II is fire and maneuver. You get one unit to put suppressing fire on a position so that the people in that position are unable to shoot back and unable to move, while a second U.S. unit, a second friendly unit, maneuvers into a position where they can then either assault or destroy that suppressed position. Well, this doesn't work so well if the unit being suppressed doesn't know that they're supposed to be suppressed. If you don't hear all the gunfire, you're a lot less likely to take cover. Yes, you will if you hear or see bullets smacking in around you, but it really has a very significant benefit to that end to hear all the noise of a couple machine guns going off. Think about the MG42. How much of its utility was from its very intimidating sound from its rate of fire? If someone's shooting at you with an MG42 and you can't hear it and you're not being hit by it, how effective can it really be? So you suppress a lot of military firearms and you potentially lose a lot of that suppression capability. Different uses for the word suppress there. Anyway, I think that's the biggest reason. Now, there are, I think, special forces units that are much more likely to use suppressors on standard firearms because they don't have the manpower to use that sort of fire maneuver tactic, depending on the specific circumstances. So, anyway, I think that's why. The noise is good. Also, the military doesn't necessarily, historically, really give a crap about its soldiers' hearing after the war is over. Today, maybe more so. 50, 100 years ago, that was just kind of part of the experience. You were deaf when you got old because you shot a lot. Mark says, if you had one light machine gun to see the U.S. Army use in World War II to replace the BAR, would it be a Bren gun or something else? I think I would have to go with the ZB-26 or ZB-30. Now, those are the predecessors to the Bren gun. They are lighter than the Bren gun. The one major downside to the Bren gun is it's chambered for .303 British, which is a rimmed cartridge, which makes magazines kind of weird. Those curved magazines are a little more awkward to carry. The ZB was a lighter gun. It used standard rimless ammunition, 8mm Mauser. There were ZBs developed experimentally in 30-06 that would have worked just fine. They experimented with them for Taiwan, or Taiwan experimented with them. In some other ways, like I would consider the DPM as a standard light machine gun, but those pan magazines are really kind of bulky and awkward to carry around. The gun otherwise is quite good, but I think overall, ZB-26, ZB-30 would be the best. So close to a Bren gun. And that's assuming we're talking about a magazine-fed gun, not a belt-fed gun. If it were belt-fed, probably MG34. All right, next up is from Christian. It says, during World War II, the .30 carbine cartridge was made with non-corrosive primers. Why wasn't the same done with 30-06? The reason is the design for the M1 carbine, which has this gas tappet system, which cannot be disassembled in the field. If you have corrosive primers in your ammunition, that gas tappet will very quickly become corroded and non-functional. So I suspect the non-corrosive primers were more expensive to use, and the Army would have been quite happy sticking with corrosive primers, except they were forced to go to non-corrosive because of the design of the M1 carbine. Next up is Logan. Looking into my first machine gun purchase, specifically an M11-9 with a Lage upper to modernize it. I know Carl enjoys it, but what are your thoughts? My thought is pretty similar. I actually have, at this point, like 6 months ago, I bought myself an M11A1, specifically because Lage currently has submachine gun uppers that are awesome. They are also just starting to sell a 5.56 caliber upper, which I'm very, very interested in getting my hands on. So they're actually making those first for the M11-9, and they will then, once they've got that in production, they will then develop the version for the M11A1. If you don't have the excellent book on the Mac series, the Mac Man, then I will point out the M11-9 is a slightly larger gun. The M11A1 was originally developed in .380 caliber. One of the things you can do with a Lage upper is convert an M11A1 to 9mm, as well as reduce the rate of fire. I like the M11A1 better than the M11-9 for the same reason that Carl does, and the reason that Carl actually bought an A1 as well, and that is it is a smaller receiver. So as a standalone gun, the M11A1 is pretty much useless. It's a .380 bullet hose. The M11-9 is not exactly the world's most practical gun, but it's a little better because it is a little bigger. However, if you're just using this as a trigger pack for something like a Lage conversion or a couple of Lage conversions, I think you're better off with the smaller gun because it will make a smaller overall package. With that Lage upper, you're going to be getting, whatever barrel length you want, you're going to be getting a good stock. It no longer matters how big the receiver is on the Mac. So the smaller you can make it, the more convenient the final gun is. So my recommendation would be an M11A1 first if you don't want to deal with that, because those are harder to find. Also, by the way, you can get M11A1s with either 9mm or .380 size grip frames. And the better one to do would be a 9mm grip frame. That will allow you to convert the gun with a Lage upper to 9 parabellum and still feed it with stick magazines in the grip. If you get one with the .380 size grip, the Lage upper can't change that grip size, so you'll be stuck with a .380 gun if you want to feed it from magazines in the grip. You will still be able to use the Lage uppers that feed from Suomi drums out in front of the receiver, and you can use that and chamber it in 9 parabellum. For the 5.56 conversion, which by the way isn't blowback, it's a locked breech. It's a really slick system as far as I can tell. For that, the grip stick size doesn't matter. But the most handy, the best Mac to get, in my opinion, is the M11A1 with a 9mm grip. Then the M11A1 .380. After that would be the M11-9. And last place would be the M10 guns in 45 ACP, because those are really substantially larger and heavier. They're probably, well, they are decent guns as they were originally designed, but to me, the whole point of getting a Mac is Lage uppers for it. Next up, we have Kevin says, I know you like the Chinese mystery pistols, but have said you wouldn't feel comfortable firing them. What other guns do you have in your personal collection that you are unable or unwilling to fire? Is this usually for safety reasons, ammo availability, or fear of damaging the condition of the gun? Some of each. So I have a couple of Chinese-made Browning 1900 copies that I'm not going to shoot because safety, because I don't trust them to actually run reliably, to be safe. I definitely have some guns that I can't or don't fire for lack of ammunition. Let's see, for example, I have an 8mm Murata Type 22 rifle that I could get custom ammo made for it if I wanted, but until I do, it's tough. 8mm Kropatschek is kind of the same thing. There's wooden bullet blank ammunition that you can find, but actual proper ammo for that is difficult. 8x50 Mannlicher is difficult. 8x56 is easy, but the original 8x50 is tricky. So yeah, there are definitely guns that I don't shoot for lack of ammunition, and there are some that I don't shoot because of condition. So I recently had a video shooting Patrick Hernandez Cuirassier Berthier carbine I have one of those as well. I'm not particularly interested in shooting mine because, especially now that I've shot his, I know what it's like. It's a very rare gun, and I don't want to take the chance that I will shoot that and crack the stock. So yeah, a little from columns A, B, and C there. Last page. Max says, is there usually an opportunity to collect brass after shooting a two-gun match? Do you try to use Berdan or steel case ammo when shooting Milsurps and odd calibers at a match to avoid losing reloadable cases? Both of those questions, I would say yes. So at two-gun, yes, it is perfectly acceptable to collect your brass. We do basically ask that people not interrupt the flow of the match to collect their brass, but typically if we're resetting targets or if shooters are moving downrange as part of the stage, once the shooter clears the rearmost section, sure, you can go up and collect your brass from when you were shooting. And at the end of the stage, when we're transitioning to the next stage, there's certainly an opportunity to pick up brass. That said, it's easier not to bother with it. So if I have the option to shoot Berdan or steel-cased ammo, I usually do. Yeah, I think that pretty well answers that one. Jason says, did Cobray ever make anything worthwhile? If so, what? If not, what was the worst? Yes, they did. And I would say what we just touched on, some of the M11 machine pistols were definitely worthwhile and made by Cobray. Now, they aren't all that worthwhile in their original form, but when you couple them with Lage uppers today, they become really cool guns. A really excellent machine gun for the price. So a great option in today's transferable market. As for what their worst gun was, I think we're going to have to go with the Terminator shotgun. I still don't really understand why they made that thing. If it was anything beyond just the looks and people who bought it entirely for the looks, not knowing or caring how terrible of a gun it is. If you want more on the Terminator, I have a whole video on the Terminator that I'll link to in the description below. Samuel says, hey Ian, I've begun a collection of surplus rifles. I'm able to find decent quality rifles for low prices that I can actually afford, but with lower prices there's often little provenance that accompanies the guns. Can you recommend any sources for understanding the possible history of various rifles? I know that's vague, so I'll narrow it by saying I have an SMLE and a Kar 98K so far. How about specific resources for those types of rifles? Well, if you're looking for like what unit used this or what theater of operations was this particular gun in, unfortunately, you're pretty much out of luck. Barring some unusual specific markings on a gun that can tell you that sort of thing, there's generally just no way to know. This is definitely true of American guns. You pick up an M1, did it go to Europe? Did it go to the Pacific? Unless you happen to have some guy's specific service record that has his rifle serial number in there specifically, and you happen to have that gun, there's really no way to know. Some countries will have unit marks on guns, and that will actually be, that's probably the most common thing that can tell you about a gun's specific provenance. But other than that, there really aren't any resources. Sorry. Drew says, is there a firearm you have really wanted to own or video that you have not been able to? At this point, probably the top gun on that list is the Fedorov, the Russian Fedorov semi-auto. I don't have any illusions about being able to own one, but I would love to get my hands on one to video. So I have a couple possibilities in the works. Hopefully one of those will come through, but that's a gun that you guys have all expressed a very deep interest in seeing that I am also personally very interested in getting a look at. JF says, on the subject of wartime simplifications, there are plenty of examples of rifle designs being modified during wartime to reduce production cost, production time, or eliminate procurement difficulties. Can you think of any good examples that actually made a more effective weapon in terms of accuracy, handling, durability, reliability, or something like that? Yeah, my one good example would be the M38 Carcano. They dramatically simplified the sights. They went from this really adjustable, went out to, depends on the model, but over 1,000 meter rear sight. And they changed that to a fixed 200 meter notch. And I think that was a definite improvement. I think the practical utility of that long range sight was minimal. It was something that certainly cost a lot more to manufacture. It was something that was prone to being damaged. It was something that was prone to being misused. Not that difficult to put it on the wrong setting and have trouble actually knowing what your zero is. And I think by the time we're in World War II, the 200 meter zero is just fine. That covers 95% of everything you'd ever need. And that trade-off was worth it. Chaitanya says, do you think the 300 Blackout is the answer to 7.62x39? It seems the obvious choice to solve the dilemma between 308 and 223. If yes, why did it take so long? No, I don't think the 7.62x39 requires any answer. I think that's a perfectly suitable cartridge on its own. I think replacing it with 300 Blackout doesn't really solve, and if there is a problem with 7.62x39, 300 Blackout doesn't solve it. What 300 Blackout solves is I want a heavy subsonic bullet that will fit in an AR-15 magazine. That's the whole reason that 300 Blackout exists. So maybe I'm missing part of the question here. I'm not sure what the problem is with 7.62x39. Joe says, what would your ideal rifle be? Do you already own it? If I was forced to only have one rifle to cover everything that I would ever want to do, well, first off, that means I'm no longer collecting rifles, so any interest in collectability is kind of out the window. And I would say my What Would Stoner Do AR-15 carbine that put together with Carl over on InRange TV. That is the most practical single rifle I own for doing anything and everything. So that's the one gun that I would keep. Sorry if that's a disappointing answer. Patrick says, hey Ian, do you think that if Germany was never reunified, East and West, we would have seen further development and possible adoption of the G11 and or caseless cartridges? No. The G11 is still, people are still tinkering with caseless ammunition. People still haven't solved the fundamental problems with it of fragility of the ammunition, heat transfer, malfunctions and malfunction clearance, obturation even. So no, I think if Germany hadn't been reunified, the G11 would have maybe continued longer as a research project, but it would not ultimately have been adopted. Daniel says, the Mauser 7184 and the Lebel 1886 seem to be very similar designs except for the cartridge. Is one superior to the other from a design standpoint? Yes, and that is in the bolt design. So the 7184 is an old black powder system. It has a single locking surface, which is the root of the bolt handle. The Lebel was improved to have a two-lug rotating bolt head with locking lugs right up at the front. That is much stronger for use with smokeless powder ammunition, and that makes the Lebel a superior design in overall to the Mauser 7184. And our last question from Martin is, what is, in your opinion, the best all-around bolt-action rifle from the World Wars? And I would say that would be the 1917 Enfield, the US 1917 Enfield. It is fast to operate, has a very smooth magazine. It is a very durable gun. It's a very reliable gun. It has great sights. The sights and trigger are generally better than Mauser 98s. It holds 6 rounds instead of 5, which isn't exactly an earth-shattering difference, but why not? It is more reliable than the SMLE. It is, I would say it has better trigger and sights than the Carcanos, better trigger and sights than the Arisakas. The Type 38 Arisaka carbine would be also definitely a gun worthy of consideration, but I think the 1917 Enfield is better than it unless weight is a real serious concern, because the 38 carbine is a very, very light, handy gun. The 1917 Enfield's a pretty bulky, heavy piece. So if that's a serious consideration, then perhaps the Arisaka, with its lighter weight, handier length, and lighter cartridge, would be worth considering. Anyway, that has been an awful lot of questions. I kind of feel like I'm starting to lose my voice. I've been a little sniffly for the last couple of days, and I don't know if you guys can tell. You probably can. But anyway, that's another Q&A video for the month. Thank you very much to everyone on Patreon who supports Forgotten Weapons. It is your support that really does make this channel possible. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I got, as usual, way more questions than I was able to use. So if I didn't get to yours and you are annoyed and think that, my gosh, it was a good question and I should have answered it, please do submit it again next month. I do try to keep an eye out for questions that are repeats and get them in. And I think that's all I've got. Thank you very much for watching.